You'll just have to click on that got it.
Got it. Okay. Uh, It's very hot here. Uh, very sultry Mawsam is there.
I think
Very
in
sultry.
Jammu it's about to rain, so it's very pleasant here now.
Yeah, it should rain only after my program. Our program is over.
Yes.
Otherwise, internet will get disconnected.
Yes, so we are live on YouTube. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Karwan. I am hosting a morning session after ages, but today I am very honored to host a wonderful teacher. I think who is respected by all my colleagues and friends and myself for his scholarship on medieval Indian history. He, I think, among the most known faces of the Aligarh School of Historiography in some senses, Professor Ishrat Alam, to talk about a very special theme actually, uh, a theme that I think all history students, all history people, or even general audience must think about. uh, you know, such thoughts on studying history is a theme that I think most of us ignore when we read history. Historiography is a part that we all often ignore. And I always ask my friends to read philosophers like E.H. Carr or R.G. Collingwood or Keith Jenkins, who has written called I don't remember the name of the book, but it's a beautiful book by Keith Jenkins. It's called Rethinking History.
Hmm.
So I think these are things that fascinates me. So today's topic, thoughts on studying history, is one that is very exciting because we also are seeing a new form of history being written in the nation these days. So we hope to touch upon that in the lecture too. I'll give a formal small introduction, though he doesn't need an introduction of the speaker. Professor Ishrat Alam is currently serving as the professor of medieval Indian history at the Advanced Institute of Historical Studies, Department of History, Aligarh Muslim University. He has authored and co-authored multiple books, including Blending Nation and Region, essays in honor of late Professor Amlendu Guha, and the varied facets of history, essays in honor of Aniruddha Ray. He is also writing a book, I think that is under construction, if you can call it, and it will be out by Oxford University Press, maybe later this year. And I hope today, from Karwan side, we are dedicating this lecture to late Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay, who remains an icon, and I think one of the two pillars of our understanding of early medieval India. The one was Professor R.S. Sharma, and the second was Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay. So we are dedicating today's Karwan lecture study thoughts on studying history to Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay. Thank you so much, Professor Alam, for agreeing to do this lecture. And without further ado, over to you, and I'll join you after the lecture for a small conversation, and we'll see if we have some questions from the audience. I'll read those out for you later. Over to
Hmm.
you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Ishan. Um, I'm grateful to the Karwa people, the members of the Karwa, and especially Ishan for asking me to, say a few things. Uh, I was just wondering as to what should I speak on. And as Ishan said that this is a rare occasion, not a very good one, but we have lost one of the stalwarts of our Indian history, Professor B.D. Chattopadhyay. When my association with him, of course, we used to read his books, but I interacted with him during his 3 years tenure in the council as member of the ICHR, and the kind of deliberations, the kind of reflections he was having on research themes, they were really very, very remarkable. I learned a lot, in fact. So with due acknowledgement of our respect to that great soul, we pray that his soul should rest in peace. That makes my task more difficult as well, because uh, when we are dedicating this lecture to such a great historian, one of the doyens of Indian history, then we have to be, we should try to move on the paths which they had created, without wavering from even by an inch. And that methodology which they pursued, D.D. Kushambi, R.S. Sharma, then B.D. Chattopadhyay, Irfan Saab, Romila ma'am, and all the people. I can't give the name of all scholars here, but they did, they made a mark in Indian history. And when you look at their works, then what we find is that nowadays, as Ishan said, that there will be some touching of the current scenario. So if you contrast the present scenario with these people and their contributions, then what we find is that they are, standing like, huge rocks, mammoths. You can't disturb their methodology, because they acted, they thought, they speculated on that kind of methodology, which has the sanctity of being, some of the very, very sacred, sacrosanct methods of history. You can't ignore them. And if you ignore, then it is at your peril, not at the peril of the subject. You will jeopardize your narrative. So, with these few words of respect for
So, so you're not audible actually. I think there is some issue uh, with the plug of the headphone. Can you plug it properly to the laptop? Uh, I've sent you a request to unmute. I think you gone on mute.
can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes,
Is it fine?
yes, sir. Now,
Your default microphone has changed to microphone. Okay.
and now you are audible. Yeah.
Huh. So, with great trepidation, I would say, when we are facing this galaxy of Indian historians on the one hand, and addressing new budding historians, the audience of yours, including you, I won't say that I am saying very high, but I do confess that we are. My place is like of an intermediary between the past generation and the present generation. So we will try to pass on whatever we have learned from these great people. Uh, and they are respected not within our country, their methodology, their works, they have international recognition. That is the index that how serious they had worked on. So with these few words, I would start. I would say that, when I had suggested this topic, thoughts on, studying history, I had a general, and I wanted this to be a kind of, a sort of a general lecture where you can have, uh, multiple kind of questions: how to write history, what to write in history, how to approach your subject. So I will bring in the specialized knowledge that is in the scheme, but I shall try to be as as simple as the subject permits me.
You are on mute. I think again.
So when we say that, we are going to study history, for the first question which arises, which history? What kind of history? To put it very simply, I will say history is the, in a very simplistic term, narrative of the past. Then the related two questions will emerge related to this narrative of past. Two questions would be, out of which, do we construct this narrative? Out of what? Out of which we construct this narrative. And secondly, second question, related question would be, whose past we want to reconstruct? Whose past we want to reconstruct? So I will come to the first point first. When we say that, history is a narrative of our of past, then inevitably you will find that there is a question of selection of facts. What Carr says, subjectivity, because history is the historian is selecting the facts. Now, at that stage, the research scholar or the historian, whoever it is, professional historians, they are confronted with one very major, major problem in writing history. That is the problem of sources. For example, if you go to the ancient past, there will be a reduction in the size of, the beam of that sources. You will find very few sources for writing for a very vast period. But coming down to our present times, these multiply. There are numerous sources now. Numerous, but there are plenty of them. It's not humanly possible for one historian to look at all the aspects with the help of all the facts. So the intervention of the historian occurs, you have to be selective. Now, given the present, situation, I mean by present, my present is in the sense of a historian, what we call modern India. So when we do look at this modern India, what we find is that there is a generation of huge many documents. Official documents are there, memoirs are there, diaries are there, plenty of documents are there. Now we will have to select from them. So there should be a criterion how to select. That criterion will lead you to two kind of things, and that is reflected in the PhDs which we examine nowadays. Either it will be an absolutely reproduction of those facts without any interpretation, or there could be interpretation along with facts, which has certain validity associated. Now, this, this is, I call it, in economic history, we say this is embarrassment of richness. So this embarrassment of richness is there. When we say we have many sources, I will just give an example by, this question I had discussed with once with, Professor Vipin Chandra Sahab when I was in ICHR, and he had come for a meeting. So I just asked him, sir, how could you handle this vast material? And he combined the vast, literary material, archival material with oral material, oral history. He did a huge survey in which Professor Aditya Mukherjee, Mirdana ma'am, Sucheta, all were involved. Many people were involved. So they devised a method also for that. So the question arises, if I ask you to write something on the basis, I'm deliberately bringing in Bipin Saab because he has made use of newspapers of, for writing on economic nationalism. He has, wide variety of newspapers he's studying. And then he comes to certain conclusions. So especially when he is dealing with, economic nationalism. Rast Guftar, you will find he's referring to a very, not well-known newspaper, but he is laying his hands on. So today, if I ask you to write a history whose narrative, as I was saying, then if I go back to 1970 and look to the newspapers, then what will appear is that our country's favorite pastime was, because that is what is reflected from the newspapers, was the what the minister said. First of all, what the prime minister said. Nowadays, fortunately and unfortunately, ministers don't say anything of their ministries. But all the time we hear about prime minister only. But I am talking about 1970s. So that will make a two periods, how you compare between the two two experiences. In 1970s newspapers, if you turn any newspaper for that matter, you will find they are mainly concerned with the statements of ministers, prime minister, president, and few pages on sports. Most of the news concerning social evils like rape, this dowry murders and dowry related cases, all these kinds of things would be. Even in the court, you will find the newspapers reports the proceedings of the courts also, high court, supreme court, local courts, wherever there's some when they think that this judgment is, or this case is interesting for other people also. So these kind of things you find. Ultimately, what you will miss is the certain categories of analysis which are not which are not regularly looked at. For example, you don't find uh, you don't find something on, say, real wages, employment, landless workers plight, women's disabilities, Dalit repression. These are not their they don't attract them, because why? So when the newspaper editor is selecting news for you, he has some idea about the preference of the audience. Who is going to purchase his newspaper? Who will read those newspapers? So from a huge mass of information which is gathered at the desk of the editor, the sub editorial team and then the editor, they select certain news items and they put it on the newspaper, considering the underlying fact behind that is their presumption is that these will be read by the people, they are of the interest of the audience, and they will find it interesting, so they will purchase the newspaper, and your newspaper circulation will increase. So there is someone who is selecting something for you. Similarly, the historian is also selecting from the historical process which he is confronted with. So for the earlier periods, unlike the editors of the modern times, for the earlier periods, when the sources are limited, we don't have plenty of sources, you will depend on your assumptions, inferences, to in order to fill the gaps of information. Varieties of interpretations are done, and that is when a historian is doing it, he will apply, they deliberately call it, a very restrained kind of a speculation. As Asia Berlin has termed his you know one title of a book is The Idea of Reality. If you read that book, he is saying about many things, but from the historical methodology point of view, I consider that title to be very appropriate, in the sense that you can't go beyond certain limit when you are imagining on the basis of certain some encounter with the fact. So you will apply restraint as speculation. You will have, in order to achieve a appreciable or respectable idea of the situation, you will have to apply restraint as speculation. So
I think there is some internet issue. Um Professor Alam, we'll wait for him to join. We'll wait for him to join again. And those who are watching us, please, sorry. And those who are joining us, please do like the stream. And if you have any question for Professor Ishrat Alam, please do ask them in the live chat, which we'll be addressing if he manages to join back. And I think he'll be back very soon. I'll just call him and we'll see. Yeah, so he says that the internet is back, and he'll join us in a few moments. So we'll wait, and by the time that he joins, maybe if you have any questions, do send them in the chat. We have some interesting sessions lined up for you this month. We have a session on the Jain Ramayana, and today we are also recording a conversation with Shama Zaidi, who is known for, as I think I mentioned earlier as well, for known for writing films like Manthan. She was also one of the researchers for the very famous show called Bharat Ek Khoj. She's also the costume designer of a film called Shatranj Ki Khiladi, which was Satyajit Ray's first Hindi film. So, so much to talk about cinema with Shama Zaidi. So do check out that conversation. It will be out on 20th, and on 17th there's another talking films with series coming up, episode of talking film series with Apurva Asrani. Apurva is the editor of films like Shahid, like Aligarh, and the cult classic called Satya. So uh, do listen to that conversation as well. And Professor Alam is back finally. Yes, you are audible and you are visible.
हाँ सुनो there was some problem. दरवाजा भेज दीजिएगा. So I was saying that whose narrative we are concerned with. The second question, which is important, that is the main subject. So when we say whose narrative, many things come into mind. Especially after 14th, 15th century, after Renaissance. If when you see Herodotus, look at the title of his book, he says histories. Histories. If you go to Thucydides, oh God, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, yes, sir, you
Ah.
are audible.
If you go to Thucydides, his title is another different, than the. Uh, just a minute. Hello. They're there. So, ठीक है, thank you. So, no, yeah, I was saying that, look at the titles of the books of those times, you will find these kind of titles. But suddenly, after Petrarch, you find there is a change in the subject. Now, he is writing a poem on Africa, he is writing national song. So the concept of nation occurs. Then suddenly, after that, you will find that they start writing about histories of, you know, national histories. Now we have this trend, well established. So we have history of China, history of India, history of, Pakistan, history of Great Britain, history of USA, history of USSR. These kind of things are coming now. So even though, I am conscious of this fact, even if these some of these countries are of very recent, origin, very recent growth, and the political or cultural frontiers of most of these countries have changed over time. For example, in case of Turkey, I will give you this example because that is a very interesting example. Now, if you ask the Turkish historians, they would say that, they would say that, their origin lies in the Greco-Roman world. They are, the successors of Greek-speaking peoples, modern Turks. In that, they are disowning their genealogical ties uh, with their ancestors located in Mongolia, Western China, say around some 1500 years ago. I personally do not find myself very comfortable with this kind of with a Turkic bias in reconstructing history of Turkey. As in the case of India, same kind of thing is happening. The connecting, origin, seeking origin from the Aryans. That is another, bias in history. So one should treat national history as the history of all those people who inhabited in earlier times a particular territory which is presently occupied by that particular nation. So, whatever language they spoke, whatever religion they professed, whatever faith they had, that is not important. They are important, but they are not the constitutive elements of the nation. Constitutive element is the geographical expression where you are locating that nation. So we encounter this kind of analogous problems very often in our own country, where people are concerned with writing history of particular caste, particular tribe, particular religious communities, history of the Jains, history of others. So when we resort to this kind of disaggregations, then we are actually creating a separate history for these identities. Special, we are espousing special identities. So there's, of course, this is not unjustified. They are justified. They are within their rights to write that. For example, in the case of women, in the case of Dalits, who these two categories I am referring because they were the most neglected in our historical narratives. So that would suggest that demand is certainly very reasonable. It is in their favor that one should, but one must at the same time, it is my feeling, we should remember remember that in reconstructing such sectional histories, sectional I'm saying, sections of the society. So in reconstructing such sectional histories, we cannot overlook the changes, broad changes in other parts of society and in the evolution of the social and political framework as a whole, if we are concerned only with a very, very minuscule part of it. So, in terms of Brodelian terminology, when we are trying to understand in the term of long duration, long dury, then we have to enlarge our scope of history, and therein these neglected sections of society should also be addressed to labor, working class. नहीं अभी मेरे अभी एक लेक्चर हो रहा है मैं बुला लूंगा आपको so I have a class so these students had come so in other words what is important is that historical accuracy should not be casualty, should not be relegated to the periphery. That should be maintained. However reasonable any group's anxiety about its identity, its history is concerned, we should not overall, ignore that. Their contributions are there, their travels are there, their pains are there. They are all subject of history, but that should be not be the sole focus of historians. They should be. I'm not saying that they should be kept out. No, then your history is no full of fault lines. Therefore, uh, now the question arises as I took a very brief survey from Herodotus to modern times to Renaissance period. What we find is that your perspective is continuously changing. Your the context is changing. The perspective is continuously changing with the lengthening of experience of historians. So, new categories of analysis, new categories of subjects, they come in, new elements of society, culture, polity, processes of changes, you know, different kind of things, they are coming within it. Uh, Karl Marx in his famous preface to Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which he wrote in published in 1859, there I found one observation by Marx, which is very relevant for today's talk. He says, I quote, one cannot judge a period, one cannot judge a period of transformation by its own consciousness. Period of transformation by its own consciousness. That practically applies to every society in the past. But this also means that we are very often very judgmental. We try to judge each past society by our own past consciousness of our past. So this might appear illogical, but it is a situation which you can't escape. And if you can't escape such a situation, then it has its own implications. And that would be reflected when you are writing history or trying to understand history. So primary implication, the first implication which I could conceive of is as our values, our views of the world, our views of how the world changes over time, our conception of scope of history, our appreciation of scope of history, they keep on revising frequently. And this happens with the passage of time. You can't ignore that. From Renaissance times, if you come to the present times, when there are so many influences, coming down to postmodernism and how that affected the study of history, I'm glad as San was talking about, Jenkins and Anchor Smith and others. If you look at Munslow, then you will find, there is host of Now we are talking, I have introduced a course in Aligarh also, where we talk about what happened to historiography after Marx. That is, what happened to historiography? What are the considerations of history in the post-Marxist situation? So, the main point is that your perspective, your subject matter will change according to the change in the perspective, according to realization, according to the maturity of the historian, erudition of the historian. This will keep on change. For example, when Mark Bloch was writing about, the First World War ended, and he was writing about French rural peasantry, French rural history. At that time, he had these two contrasts. On the one hand, there was the French Revolution of 1789. On the other hand, there was the Bolshevik Revolution of 1970. So this now he started comparing between the two. Before him, everybody was emphasizing the great achievements of French Revolution. But when he compared, he found that um, it is true that French Revolution brought into focus the values of reason, rationality, democracy, and the people's inalienable rights over property, private property, and even to a certain extent gender equality also was there. But hereafter, it was no longer, after the French Revolution had taken place, look at the perspective how it is changing. Now the king is not very important. The monarchies, rulers are not important. Religious men are not very important. Saints are not very important. During Renaissance period, this had happened that a whole series of hagiographies were written because they were being increasingly challenged by the Renaissance writers, Petrarch, Lorenzo and Bodin and others. So, in return, since the printing press has come, that technology had come, so they started producing the clerical class, the church people. They started producing their documents, publishing them. They started writing about one particular saint, which I would call they were hagiographies. They were not historical works, but that would impact the history writing. So this is happening. This happens, after the French Revolution, when this principle of adult suffrage was introduced, which was first propounded by the Jacobin Constitution of 1794. So it has its analogy, it has its origin in the march of every man to the center stage in the ideal history of the present day historian. So the aspirations of women also for equal status have led to ever expanding. It is expanding every time. There are broadly three phases, but it is expanding and expanding. Their concerns with women's history, gender history, it is called. So the current, now we are concerned with our ecological system. We are concerned about our climate. So all these big talks on climate is taking place. So you are concerned with warming of the globe. So that aspect also will be influencing somewhere in understanding history. We are concerned with biodiversity. Every other day you will find that newspaper they report that in 1 minute how many species of birds or plants, flora and fauna, they are disappearing from the globe, from the surface of the earth. So if you are an intelligent man, you are concerned with your global identity, then you are concerned with your earth also. So you are concerned with ecosystem also. So these are, this is an expand. Now, if you talk about these things to Herodotus, I don't think he could prevent himself from falling asleep. What you are talking, we are not bothered. But in this stage, if I talk to my students, to my friends, as I'm addressing today, they will say, okay, he's right. I don't know how far I'm right, but I assume that you will agree with me. So this is how your this large scale destruction of habitats of human numerous species. Uh, Now, UNESCO in 1990s had published a series which I found very interesting. I always look at the titles of the books and then I decide which book should I read. History, they produced, I think, 7 volumes of history of humanity. They are more concerned with technology, science. Of course, there are chapters on religion as well. So they are also, concerned with ideologies. They are concerned with many, multiple dimensions of human progress. And the title is History of Humanity. That is a kind of summation of the aspirations of historians. Now they have widely widened their scope of writing history. In other words, history itself may be said to have changed the nature of history, if I can say so. Why? Because this change in the historical perspective also introduces, as I was saying, the French Revolution century afterwards as the great property system in the entire world, and especially with reference to the agrarian relations. But after the Soviet Revolution, 1917, it was found that all landlords and capitalists, they lost their property in USSR, whereas this was not the situation in post 1789 France. Of course, some of the big landlords, they had fled. There was an emigration. The ecclesiastical people also had fled. They had left behind ecclesiastical properties which were redistributed, but that was on a limited scale. That was not as general as you find in the case of landlords and capitalists losing their property after the coming of the Soviet, Soviet Revolution. So Mark Bloch, when he is writing his book French Rural History in 1928, he found that French Revolution was actually a continuity with the past rather than a volatile break, wholesale break. Because France, was only about third of the in France, only one third of the landlords have lost their lands, not the entire lot. So, by the same token, the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, if it was such a big achievement, then why in 1991 the Soviet Union also passed off? That also, that is again a milestone. That is again a substantial change in the, in the history of the people. And now, this breakdown of Soviet Union led people to think, the historians to think, that uh, they started supposing that the efficiency of the market was more important than the property relationships, because it was considered that market is the key to the development, key to the economic development. And by this time, remember always, by this time, 1928, by this time, the there are changes in the economic side also. In the economic thought also, there are changes from Adam Smith, Ricardo, to Schumpeter and then Keynes. You find there are changes in the appreciation of the economic development. Similarly, in the other fields like in sciences, physical sciences, pure sciences, there are also revolutionary changes taking place, and they are always in a state of flux. So they are change. This happens because of the change in the perspective. If you remained, not believed in Copernicus or others, and had remained, concerned with, you know, um, the geostationary system, then your ideas would have been outdated. You could not have realized the changes which are taking place. So it was realized that it is the economic development and wherein the market plays a crucial role. And in the globalization also, it is the market which is playing a crucial role. So the historian's perspective will also change. When we are studying British history, I mean Indian history in the British times, our perspective will be different. And when R.C. Dutt is writing, his perspective was, when before that, when Dadabhai Naoroji is writing, his perspective was different. They were, he is taking into consideration the economic aspects, the lifespan of the people of India, that he considers as an index of the growth of India. But among Indian historians, we have, especially my friend, my uh, he was more than a friend to me, Professor Rajat Datta, who died a very premature death, very brilliant historian, and the other gentleman, Tirthankar Rai, with whom I interact very often in conferences. So they also look at the same development of Indian history from a different point of view. I do not mean to say that Bloch or the two Indian historians which I have referred to, they are necessarily right in their assessment of histories. You can question their, assessments. Uh, Here, my objective is just to underline the fact that with the lengthening of historical experience, with the lengthening of the experience of human beings, as we when we as act as historians, when we try to interpret our past, we find continuously that our perspective would be shaping and reshaping, in a very, very, effective way, our views of the past in uh, divergent ways, not one single manner, divergent ways. Second factor, which is often, very conveniently overlooked, is the growth of human thought, which, can never grow if it is static. I remember I invoke, Professor Atharali's uh, passing of the Empire essay, which was published in Modern Asian Studies, uh, or it was published in Royal Asiatic Society. When he pointed out that when Europe was, you know, concerned with sciences, when they were developing their mathematics, they were doing, improving their understanding of mathematics, they were going towards precision. Our intellectuals were, concerned with Majmu al Bahrain, mingling of oceans. That is to say, religion. Once again, we are in that grip. So, how far you will grow, you can realize, you can visualize. So, there should be, when we are discussing development of human thought, we can't develop human thought without debate and discussions. Without debate, discussion, and reflections. So, you have to have that. And any society which has this, you know, mm, these, aspects in their lives, And if these categories are very dear to them, their individual freedom, liberalism, and accommodation, adjustment, then that society will develop a debate. You know, I seriously say, but in a very casual manner, I tell my students that how do you rate yourself in the 21st century compared to the 16th century of India? When you had Nanak, you had Kabir, you had Nanak, you had Namdev, you had so many, people who were challenging, who were questioning the hegemonic thoughts of those times. They were not executed. They were read. They were heard. They were followed. This is what I mean by when I say that, the society, when it reaches such a stage of development of human thought, where they can debate issues, they can have arguments on the issues, then you see there is a likelihood of development of changes. And this is very true of history as well. As an illustration, I can also say how the historical perspective or perceptions even among the Marxists have changed over time. Marx said something in the 19th century, mid 19th century, but by mid 20th century, the Marxian approach was not exactly as Marx had prescribed. Some of his formulations were questioned. They were questioned by Rosa Luxemburg. They were questioned by Lenin. They were questioned by others. You know, Maurice Daub and others. So, uh, he said that he visualized in the book, Communist Manifesto, which he wrote along with Engels. They said that there were stages of development. This is 19th century perception. First, it was primitive communism, which was succeeded by slave mode of production, slavery, then feudal mode of production, then capitalist mode of production, then socialism. So these were the modes of production. And they were generally treated as universally valid, largely on the basis of some of the statement of Marx. Not all, selective. Down to 1950s, I'm saying it deliberately, I'm bringing it to 1950s because in 1956, D.T. Kosambi came out with his introduction to the study of Indian history, which was also, which has, demonstrable impact of Marx on him. Uh, and he is, D.T. Kosambi made very profound study of history, and he found that, he had his own, assessment of Indian history, how he finds that there is a continuation of feudalism for a very, very long time till 19th century. But what is important for us is that, you know, how far and how, since how long these researches have been done and discussions have been held practically on international scale after Second World War. I mean, when we discuss Eric J. Hobsbawm in 1964, he was one of the earliest Marxist historians who, believed in relaxation of the unilinear pattern of history. Unilinear, you know, scheme which Marx had prescribed. Although he simultaneously espouses the concept of Asiatic mode of production, which was rejected by subsequent historians. Wittfogel had, you know, re-strengthened it, but Irfan Habib and others, they contradicted it. They said, no, this can't be the guiding principle. Therefore, All these multiple factors are there behind you, which is going to make you as a historian. You can't say that I won't listen to these kind of arguments. Because now we are, after Mark Bloch gave the concept of, two very crucial concepts, that is comparative history and comprehensive history, total history, which inspired Laduri and others, even Brodel, to go beyond what Mark Bloch had written about. So we will have to expand our, scope of history along with our, what I call it, lengthening experience of our past. So all debates, all hypotheses, they will have to follow certain norms. You can't follow Carl Fisher, in his History of Europe in 1935. In his preface, he wrote that history is full of contingencies, full of accidents. He considered, 1789 French Revolution as an accident in history. So you can't, since 1935, much water has flown down the Ganges or Yamuna or Rhine. So we will have to revise our opinion of history. So we will have to have, new perspectives. Um, Therefore, the guiding principle for all narratives which are dealing with history uh, should be, they should be first concerned with historical facts. I say it within quotes because nowadays we are finding many historical facts within quotes appearing in the newspaper, or when you talk to the, learned professors of various colleges and universities, you find it very alarming. I find it very alarming, very disturbing, as well as very distressing. Because recently I was, sorry for being little autobiographic, but I can't avoid this. Recently I was in a selection committee where there was a gentleman from one of the provincial universities, and he said, "Sir, in your, this um, chronicles," he cited the example of Bashanama. He said, most of the facts which are there, real facts are not conveyed. They have, suppressed those facts. They have ignored that facts. So I said, what kind of facts you are trying to reveal? He said, I had gone to certain village and I found that, this particular name was actually some other name of a gentleman. So they said that in order to, pay kharaj, pay land tax to the Mughal emperors, they had changed their names. Now these are all, fiction of imagination or imaginative exercises. How can a gentleman who is, living in our modern contemporary period can be a source? I will come to this question of source for a history of say 17th century, or for that matter of ancient past, great ancient past. So you will have to follow certain historical methods in writing history, where potentially I would say, as following E.H. Carr, that all facts are not historical facts. Only those facts are historical facts which have certain consequences, which had consequences. Like, the famous example, you all must be knowing it, the Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Or such facts are actually illustrations. Illustrations. For example, crossing of a particular river illustrative of such crossings. Carr says about both. He says that, if you sit down and start noting how many wagons have passed, what did they carry, were they carrying commodities or human beings, you can write that, you can note that. If in case of human beings, how many human beings in one cart, that will tell you how many people were migrating from one place to other. In the case of commodities, they will tell you that from surplus zones, they were going to the deficient zones. But they are historical facts. Therefore, this is certainly a reasonable, I would say, indication how one should go about selecting facts out of a very large number of facts which are strewn around. And the second category of historical facts, which Carr mentions, relates to, you know, the historian's function of selection. But there also you will have to adhere to the canons of selection of facts. So all such facts which are historical, which have been mentioned, in other words, treated as historical facts in the writings of others or earlier historians, they should, you can check them or you can believe them, because he says that if Battle of Waterloo took place in such and such year, or Battle of Panipat took place in such and such year, those are accepted facts. Nobody can say that you contradict that fact. Those you will have to reckon with. Uh, but when you are looking for facts, evidence, then I bring in here, Leopold von Ranke's assessment. Ranke, tried to establish certain rules by which one can, one kind of evidence could be selected, the other kinds of evidence could be rejected, or in other words, you can say one's kind of sources for historical facts could be preferred in comparison to the other. And his guiding principle, the basic fundamental or foundational principle which he advocated was that it should be, the source should be closer in time, in terms of time and space. You should be an eyewitness in terms of time and space, because he believed that statements that are closest in terms of time and space to the event described must be given some credit and should be considered as the primary source rather than the latter sources or more distantly placed reports. So in terms of time and space. Second principle, which he laid down was linguistic rigor. That historians should be very careful when they are interpreting particular terminology. For example, if you read this is very often uh, conveyed in our day-to-day talks also, that suppose, suddenly you hear about scientist who had been awarded a Nobel Prize for some discovery, fundamental discovery, then immediately, and this is true of all people, immediately you will find everybody will claiming that, look here, what is new in that was available in our religious texts, whatever religion they might belong to, as if when this term was applied by the writers of those texts, they had same meaning. Petrarch, the entire Renaissance school, the Enlightenment period, they all emphasized on this point of philology, antiquarianism and philology. They said that, look here, you will have to understand the significance of a term in the context of that particular time and space. They might have different meaning because words keep on changing their meanings. They have this habit, but they are dynamic things. In 1469, there was a dictionary written in Malwa, which is known as, you know, the writer's name is Mahmoud Shadiabadi. He had written the book called uh, Mahmoud Shadiabadi's book, and that is a glossary actually, where he is giving, and that is a very unique kind of work, because he gives the words which are currently in use of his time 1469, and what were the other terms which have become obsolete by 1469, and they had same meaning, or sometimes he gives the words which have different meanings. So you will have to be very particular. You will have to have, very good control over the over the languages of the time. In Aligarh, we emphasize that we must learn some language. In every good institute, good university, there is a heavy emphasis on learning the language of those times and then trying to interpret it. So that is there. Uh, so linguistic rigor should be there. Ranke was saying that. And what we find is that after some time, Ishan, do I have some time?
Yes, sir. We have about 10 minutes.
Okay, then I will finish. So, going beyond Ranke, we have this gentleman Namier. He was a Polish and a great, historian who the structure of politics in the reign of George III he tried to write, but he has, gone beyond Ranke, and he says that it is not enough to have, the source should not be contemporary in terms of time and space, but there is a distinction between among the sources. He says that there are two categories. One could be called as primary source, the other could be called secondary source. Now he is, refining it further and making it problematic also. It had a very serious consequence, which I will refer to later on. When he says that there are different kind of sources, he had this guiding, canonical principle of Leopold von Ranke, that only those sources can be relied which are contemporary in terms of time and space. But within that broad category of sources, you will have to distinguish between the two. There are two kinds of sources, primary and secondary. For us, following Ranke, and we are generally following Ranke, we consider, because there is a dearth of sources, our problem is different, which was not the problem for Mr. Namier. So, especially in the case of ancient and medieval period. So, he is saying that, when he studied George III's parliament, he disintegrated them, and then he found that he prescribed that one should look into the private motives of the members of the council, of the council, of the House of Commons. What are the private motives? What are their aspirations? What are the aspirations of their peers? What are the aspirations of their friends and families? It is those facts which is influencing this member of parliament's decision. He is not there for for bringing in change which is not yielding anything to him. This he could realize when he analyzed the letters of the Whig members and Tory members, the liberals and the conservatives. He found, at one level, they are both, you know, unanimous in passing an act. How could their ideology be same? Liberals have different ideology, these conservatives have different ideology. So he said, he argued, therefore, in order to unfold the real history, you will have to look into the private documents of these people. By that, he meant letters, biographies, diaries, personal jottings. Only then you can find, you can be closer to the reality. That is to the historical fact. Otherwise, if you go by the official pronouncements, official declarations, then you are misled. You are waylaid. Not only misled, you are waylaid. You are taken away from the, from the exercise of historical methodology, because you are no more concerned with the reality. Therefore, Namier suggested that when you are studying, sources, you should be very careful. You should distinguish between the private documents and the public documents, and you should prefer the private documents over public documents, official documents, I mean. And one thing more he had said was that you will have to take all precaution when you are trying to unfold history. Precaution against these categories as well. This aspect our later historians have ignored. I don't find this is reflected in the works of Lucy Sutherland or in the works of Anil Seal. Anil Seal, when he is writing about our Indian nation movement, he is saying, and following him, Paul Brass and others, he is saying that it was actually not a national movement. It was for the satisfaction of the elites of the time, their ambitions of the time. For example, he is reducing Dadabhai Naoroji. I'm using a very harsh word, reducing Dadabhai Naoroji to a very, this kind of a utilitarian person. He consulted Dadabhai Naoroji's personal letters to his friends in India, in which he asked for money so that he could maintain himself in England. Now, it is very easy to say that he was there enjoying life, but when you go into the real facts, what you find is when Dadabhai Naoroji is collecting material, or when even Aligarh Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, they are Sir Syed Ahmad Khan तो उतने बूढ़े नहीं थे, but Dadabhai Naoroji was in a very advanced stage of his life. So that's why I use the term reducing, because you are reducing and you are, by following, you are deducting something which is not meant in those letters. Those letters, the asking for money was not for enjoyment. It was for his sustenance, so that he could complete his, research, which brought him to poverty of un-British rule ultimately, where you have such, distinct categories. Again, the perspective. When Dadabhai Naoroji is writing, national income has become very important category. Average span of life has become very important category of analysis. That shows the material progress of that country. And there are many other categories which Dadabhai Naoroji. So the perspective has changed accordingly, Dadabhai Naoroji. But so far sources are concerned, you know, this is the kind of problem we are facing. When Anil Seal is writing in 1968, Dadabhai Naoroji was assessing the entire, India's economic relationship with Britain. Entire economic relationship with Britain. Indian commitment was too large and too unrewarding for Britain. That was Anil Seal's assessment, जो कि ब्रिटिश हिस्टोरियंस भी कहते हैं, कैम्ब्रिज स्कूल के लोग भी कहते हैं कि ये तो लाइबिलिटी थी, वाइट मैन्स बर्डन की थ्योरी चलाते हैं. So poverty and un-British rule, which was written in 1901, and soon, Arsidas Economic History of British Rule in India, 2 volumes, again 1901 and 1903. They, they they are illustrations of the real anxiety of these people. Another element, which we should keep in view, and with this I will conclude my talk, the relationship of history to a number of other branches of knowledge, of which I spoke, in a very tertiary manner in the middle of the lecture. But how do this perspective keep on changing? And how do they influence the scope of history? In first case, take the example of archaeology. It's an allied sciences of history. Archaeological findings, numismatics, epigraphy, paleography, you know, the linguistics, historical linguistics, study of languages, establishing of cognates across languages, with which you can do the exercise in the case of Rigveda and Zendavesta. By establishing those cognates, you can say how close they were. The carbon dating, for that matter, which was the prerogative of the physics of physical sciences, thermoluminescence, which enabled us to date organic material and find artifacts. Similarly, biological sciences, domestication of animals and plants, and of late, genetics. Now the genome factor has been decoded. Now there is no race theory. It has been proved absolutely bogus, absolutely invalid, because it has been found that origin lies at one place, at same. You know, Therefore, our scope of history also changes with the scope of widening of the branches of knowledge, social sciences, arts, sciences, pure sciences, and there is a lot many integration of these into the discipline of history, which explains our our passage over a long time. Take for example Durkheim. Take for example Darwin. How origin of a species has influenced Marx. You know, survival theory of the survival of the fittest. How the human beings survive because they have greater cranial capacity according to you know the the biological scientists, that you have better cranial capacity to understand things. To my students, I always jokingly say that cranial capacity is what your engine in the car represents. You always say 100 cc engine, or 1000 cc engine, 1200 cc engine. So is the brain. It has that kind of power. So with the increasing, scope of history, with the increasing integration of various branches of knowledge, and both cognitive and cognitive, and then you you find that history is not you know um, is treated his history not to be treated in exclusivity. It will have to engage with all the developments around if you want to have a flourishing scientific secular historiography, history, writing of history. So, with these few words, I conclude. I can go on speaking on, but for the moment, this is sufficient. I hope so.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful
Oh, Ishan,
lecture.
I can't hear you. You unmute yourself.
Uh, am I
Yeah,
audible now?
yeah. Now you are.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful lecture. I was making notes throughout um, of various terms that you use, various scholars that you mentioned. And I think this lecture is going to help a lot of students. uh, it will help me and my generation of history students who are going to get into MA, masters now, and they are doing their PhDs. uh, because I think it is important to understand the discipline that you are into. Sometimes to as I started with that we do not take this historiography part, this philosophy of history, very seriously. We think that it is not very important. We must talk about the dates and the facts and what happened, what not. But this whole concept of history, I think, is something to be understood. today. So thank you so much for giving this, I think, the best introduction to the discipline of history today on Karwan. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
And
I'm glad that you appreciate it.
and those who are watching us, if you have any question, please drop them in the live chat. I think I have two questions for you
Yeah.
in the chat. These are by Shashwata Bhattacharya. His question is, can you please throw some light on the concept of time in history? I think that would take a lot of time, but briefly, if you can talk about the concept of time in history.
In fact, I've, I didn't say, but when I was saying about lengthening experience of historians, I had this time in perspective. You know, that's why when I started from Herodotus, I had this in mind. You know, history in long durée, how it has evolved and how it is evolving. You can't say it is static. It is evolving over a period of time. Now we have, in terms of time, if you look at the time scale, then what was considered as history in our distant past is quite different from what is being written nowadays about history on historical themes. So both are, for us, though that concept of history which was there in the remote past is quite different from our our conception of history. And from, if you ask Mr. Herodotus to come and understand history, he would be surprised to see what are they talking about. His sources were different, our sources are different, you know. So time I had in mind, and that's why I was, in fact, the entire framework was within that broad time framework.
Yeah.
Without time you can't understand history.
Yes.
And just for just to let our listener know that if you want to understand the value of time, or the importance of time in understanding history, then I will request you to read one of the major writings of Amartya Sen, who has dealt with time in history. It's a very good essay. And the other thing is by there is a book by uh, I'm confusing. It's either by Dale or or Stephen Blake. No, it is by Blake. He has written a book on concept of time in history. And Romila ma'am has written a very good article on time. So those things will enrich.
Thank you for these book recommendations in between. I think that are going to be very insightful for students who are going to, not just students, but people of all ages who are going to listen to this conversation later.
Ishan, I tried to be very general,
Yeah.
because history is, as a discipline, is the biggest casualty in modern times. As a discipline, I am pained rather.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yeah,
sir. I think it. I was reading a book called "The Practice of History in India" by Anirudh Deshpande,
yeah,
professor at Delhi University, and he
yeah.
mentions in his book that in India, every person is a weekend doctor and a weekend historian. So
And I will add, and a cricketer.
yeah, and a cricketer, and
Yeah,
then they have, and they doubt the historian, and they debate with the historian without any facts.
yeah. How can you engage with them?
Yeah. So there is another question by Shashwata. Can you comment something on Tirthankar Roy's argument of diversification of market, which according to him actually not only helped to the survival and prosperity of the handloom industries, but I think that question is something to do with the academia. Uh,
Yeah,
if you want to take that question, I don't think that is related to the lecture.
yeah. I would just say that Tirthankar Roy is a good friend of mine. We agree to disagree with each other with due respect to each other. I'm going to meet him in 20th and 24th in Paris. So, as I said, that you can have facts, but your opinion could be different. He is also using the same facts. Otherwise, he is not inventing facts in order to justify his position. Whereas the critics like, how can you deny RC reports about what happened to Indian economy? How can you deny BB Chaudhry's monumental works? How can you deny, Irfan Habib's, the famous essay on colonization of Indian economy? You know, how can you deny? My suggestion to my advice to all my students is that read both and then form your opinion. I would, impose my opinion on you. Read both. So I same I would tell Shashwata also, the read both and then form your opinion before joining any. But do keep rationality, rational approach intact when you are reaching, such debatable themes. These are just like, as crucial as, when Copernicus was trying to say that it is the solar system in which Earth is rotating, not the other way around. That kind of question is this also.
Yeah. So when you said rationality,
Otherwise, how can how can you understand colonialism?
yeah,
These people, Tirthankar and others, they deny colonialism. This is a very wide, but they are also selling. There
yeah,
are purchasers.
yeah, yeah. And when you
I,
mentioned,
I, I will, Ishan, I will just narrate here
yeah,
one of the personal experiences. Indian History Congress gives awards to best books. So Professor Satish Chandra Saab, he was undergoing kidney treatment. Also, he was suffering from kidneys ailment. And I asked him, sir, should I bring the books to your place, or would you like to come to ICHR? He said, now look at the difference of the approach. For me, his convenience was of paramount importance. For him, it was not. He said, Ishrat Sahab, by that time I shall be free from my dialysis, and dialysis is a very devastating thing for the human physique. And straight away, after getting dialysis done, he came to ICHR and he said, okay, Professor Shirmali Saab was also there. He said, where are the books? So he said, Shirmali Saab, you concentrate on, ancient India. I will concentrate on medieval. Sabyasachi will concentrate on modern. And all these three experts were, and I was just observing how these elders are, behaving. Are they very, erratic? Or there is the systematic approach. And Satish Chandra Saab, he was reading so fast. He would flip through and read the major arguments. One of the persons, I wouldn't, I for for privacy's sake, I would not name him. This gentleman thought that his friend might get an award, so he pushed his book towards Satish Chandra Saab. By that time, Satish Chandra had read that book. I had seen that. So he looked at that professor and said, "Bhai, Dr. Saab, this gentleman is not written for Indian audience. And for whom he has written, they will give him many things. And our Indian History Congress is very frugal. We have very small budget. That budget will not satisfy him. So forget about it. He kept the book aside. Then I got this inkling that look here, how quickly he was going into the main arguments. He would look at the footnotes, look at the sources, read in between, and the conclusions he would very much concentrate on. More than 56 books he assessed. Same was the thing with Sabyasachi also. Of course, in ancient India we had very few books, but Shri Mali Sahib was equally equally very tenacious. He was also very methodical. So what we should learn from these stalwarts is that whatever methods have been developed over a period of time, and as I said during my lecture also, that is it is a evolving discipline. Whatever new you can bring in methods from other disciplines, it will always enrich your experience as a historian. It will be more satisfying rather. Right.
Thank you so much, sir, for that answer. And I think those are the questions as of now. But people can always send their questions to Carvan on our email ID. Our email ID is carvanheritage@gmail.com. So please do send questions. We'll forward your questions to Professor uh, Alam, and he'll get back to you. But thank you so much, Professor Alam, for taking our time this morning. We tried earlier also, but because of the internet, we couldn't do it. But
No,
finally, we were able
to,
to.
today we defeated the internet's capacity to
Yeah,
interrupt.
finally we crossed the Rubicon, and
Yeah.
we became successful in this. But those who are listening, please do share the lecture with your friends who are studying history, who are interested in history. Please do ask them to follow Carvan. Do like the video. We will be back with another lecture very soon on 16th about partition and its impact on food cultures uh, of Punjab, undivided Punjab and undivided Bengal, which became Bangladesh and Pakistan later. So do join for that conversation. We have Mariam Jilani from Philippines, who is a chef and writer of Pakistani descent. We have
Mhm.
Professor Pushpesh Pant, Chef Ranveer Barar, and Preet Hassan.